So Ingilby, we've just been having an interesting discussion on supply chain in Asia, supply chain in Australia, and you touched on the topic of leadership in supply chain. So what are your thoughts on that? That sounds like it could be some fascinating thoughts.
Yeah, look, I think as supply chains have evolved as such important functions in businesses, particularly large manufacturers, large distributors, where you're juggling the decisions between the big constraints of the inputs into a manufacturing process, or whether you're buying raw materials or buying finished product and pushing them through your supply chain to end customer. And supply chains are now making those important constraint-based decisions, which have got to be all commercially driven. So you end up in such an important leadership role when you sit down at the executive SOP meeting, for example, Sales Operations Planning meeting, and you're helping drive the operational effectiveness of an organisation, and you're making important business decisions, and ideally strategic business decisions that are 3, 6, 9, 12, ideally 24 months out. And I think this has sort of evolved from the very basic SOP process that organisations will run, which is they can happen daily, weekly or monthly, where it's really just making sure we've got rosters and constraint base and raw materials and bills of lading are all lined up, and we're okay to do whatever we've got to do to get to a set of customer default measures that we want to get to. And as you take that up the organisation, it becomes business reviews and it becomes more strategic. And certainly in the organisations I've worked for, in Goodman Fielders and BlueScopes, as you go up into the organisations and take the leadership of that SOP process, they become an executive SOP process, they become an executive business review process, and ideally you're executing strategy, evolving strategy, discussing strategy, and hopefully challenging and creating strategy. And I think that's such an interesting change over time, where strategy would be driven top down often from an organisation, maybe CEO, maybe consultant driven, CFO, and suddenly I think you're starting to see the supply chain heads, directors, chief supply chain officer, wonderful titles, having such an important role.
Have you seen that grow in Australian industry? I mean, people have talked about it for years, but are we seeing that now more in larger companies where supply chain does have a seat at the top table?
The short answer is yes, but it's I think Australia's been very slow. So, BlueScope, we've only, my role has only been sitting at the front table now since 2011. Prior to that, it sat sort of inside the organisation at various shapes and sizes. If you go to Nestle, Unilever, particularly the multinationals, their supply chain head will sit at the front table. They'll also they will all have a hybrid, sort of a matrix structure, support to a product group, in a global product group, and possibly a regional set of accountabilities as well. So multinationals, I think that's been we've seen that for some time. For local manufacturers, look at the beverage companies, that happens in Coke, absolutely. Foster's, Lion Nathan, getting there. So short answer is I think we'll get in there. I mean, the retailers have had, Michael Luscombe became the CEO. He's probably one of Australia's first supply chain leaders to become a CEO of the top 10 organisation. We haven't seen that at Coles, but they're John Durkin there at Coles was the supply chain head. He's now the CEO. He was sort of imported there from overseas. Ian McLeod brought him in, and so the retailers, I think that's at the end of the day, they are a supply chain. Their business is buying and reselling products on shelves, and such a critical part of their business. So I think it's happening slowly but surely. It needs to happen quicker. If you go offshore, it's far more prevalent in big organisations. They do get it, as far as I can see.
So what would you say to someone who is thinking of getting into supply chain? Is it a higher profile function these days? Or would you say become an accountant or a lawyer?
Yeah, look, it's an easy answer. Why would you want to be an accountant or a lawyer when you can become a supply chain executive and rule the planet?
That's right.
It's a lot more fun. You can be a lot more creative. You can, you can have a very exciting role. The big difference is in supply chain, you get that width. You see the organisation from raw materials to finished products. You see this wonderful width of an organisation. That's why the CEO of Unilever came from supply chain. The CEO of Walmart came from supply chain. The CEO of Coles we talked about came from supply chain. Because these guys and girls have got this wonderful width. They're perfect people to go up the chain and become CEOs. So I would argue over time, you're going to see supply chain become more and more professional, more understood, and with excellent succession opportunities, both to CEO positions, if that's where they want to go, certainly the executive teams, and, well, I'm going in my next journey, board roles. How many boards today have supply chain expertise sitting around their table? Very few. A lot of accountants and lawyers, governance type people. They need people that actually understand how businesses tick, and I think that's where people like me will be able, in my next chapter, will be able to offer hopefully some of those opportunities.
So I think on that note, for those thinking of a supply chain career, get into it. Ingilby Dickson, thanks very much.
Absolute pleasure.